Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our monthly PPOB meeting. And I guess we look around, we have a quorum. And Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Senator McDaniel, Senator Mills, Senator Neal, Senator Nemes,
Present.
Senator Parrott, Senator Thayer,
Here.
Senator Wilson, Representative Duplessis, Representative Fleming, Representative Graham,
Here.
Representative Petrie,
Here.
Representative Pratt, Representative Weber, Representative Wheatley,
Here.
Mike Harmon, John Hicks, Victor Maddox, Sharon Mattingly, Representative Miller,
Here.
Senator Higdon,
Here.
Representative Tipton.
Here.
We have a quorum and call this meeting to order. First order of business is approval of the minutes, and we do have a small change to the minutes. Last time we Mr. Totten contacted us and we kind of misquoted him, so we have a correction in the minutes on that, very minor correction. So with that said, motion for approval of the minutes. We have a motion and a second. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Okay, the first item on the agenda, Bo Barnes. Sick leave update and temporary reemployment after retirement provisions. Bo, it's always good to see you. I guess, and everybody here knows who you are, but for the record, please identify yourself and the floor is yours.
Bo Barnes, Deputy Executive Secretary and General Counsel for the Teachers Retirement System. I have with me today, hopefully remotely, Mr. Ed Kavanaugh with TRS's outside independent actuarial, Kavanaugh McDonald. He is attending remotely today because he is in business travel today, but he will be able to be here for the presentation on the sick leave. Today's topics. We have several slides today as well. The first is sick leave, and I'll talk about that in just a second. The temporary retired return to work, and that's talking about the provisions under which retired members may retire and return to work for a TRS employer. And then also we could add to this slide TRS investment returns, cash flow, and asset allocation. But first, we'll start with sick leave. And I know that probably most members of this board are familiar with some of the actuarial concepts about funding and liabilities, but we've been asked today to talk about a letter that was prepared by CAVMAC in response to questions about funding for sick leave, primarily funding for sick leave and liabilities of sick leave and changes as a result of the budget that was just enacted. And so we're going to go over those. We get kind of into some details with actuarial concepts with this letter, which we're going to talk about here just very shortly. And again, even though I believe that probably most members are familiar with a lot of these actuarial concepts, I might, if I may, just very briefly go over some of the fundamentals again. So I think that'll help kind of put the letter in context and kind of be a refresher reminder about, what we're trying to do. So first of all, all pension plans need contributions. And why do we need these contributions? Well, obviously to pay benefits. But how do we use those contributions? How are they being applied? And first, you are trying to pay for the normal cost of the plan. That's what actuaries call it. That's what other public pension plans will call that, the normal cost. And the normal cost is how much do you have to put aside each year for those active teachers out there teaching throughout their careers that with, and this is a very important with, that with investment income you can earn those contributions, that you will be able to pay those benefits when they come due, when those teachers retire and start drawing retirement allowances. And in pension plans, investments pay the majority of those benefits, just like with some of the 401k who starts out early. It's going to be their investment income earned on that 401k account, not the contributions that pay for most of their retirement. So we have the normal costs that we have to pay that we need to address. And in addition to the normal costs for plans like TRS, there's a second cost in addition to the normal cost, and that's the unfunded liability cost. That is the shortfall in assets that we have today to pay for those benefits that are, even with the normal cost contributions coming in. So we have two things that we are trying to pay with those contributions. It doesn't matter where those contributions, what streams are coming from. We just need to make sure, and the actuary wants to make sure, that each year in total we're getting all the funding we need to pay for the normal cost and to pay for that unfunded liability. Okay, is what we're attempting to do here. With that said, there are a number of contributions that TRS receives to help make sure that we do that. We have, for example, the fixed statutory employer contribution. We have a fixed statutory employee member contribution. We have what's called the actually determined employer contribution, or ADEC, that we ask for in addition to those fixed statutory contributions. Those fixed statutory contributions are more than enough to pay for the normal cost, but they're not enough to pay for off that unfunded liability. And as a reminder, what we're trying to do with the unfunded liability cost is we're trying to pay that, like other pension plans, over a set period of time. In our case, it's 30 years. We now have less than 22 years left in that amortization period. And when we pay off that unfunded liability, and when TRS is 100% funded, then the cost of TRS will be a little bit less in today's dollars, a little bit less than Social Security. So really the problem, as you can see, is dealing with this unfunded liability, and that's what the problem has been. So we, in addition to the ADEC, the fixed statutory employer contribution and member contribution, there's another funding source that we had up to now, and that was something that's often referred to as green box dollars. And the green box dollars reflect special appropriations that were distinct line item budget requests in each budget. And those green box dollars were going towards past benefit adjustments, or benefit adjustments and liabilities, okay? And the only two remaining at the end of this, the only two benefit liabilities remaining at the end of this budget were, one, some old supplemental cost of living adjustments that were over and above the fixed statutory 1.5% cost of living adjustment. Teachers get a 1.5% every year. And then in past years, when budgets were better, sometimes additional funding would be provided to provide a cost of living adjustment above the 1.5% cost of living adjustment. Okay, that hasn't happened since 2008, but we still had appropriations in the budget for those 2008 and a few years prior COLAs, because they were being paid for on a 20-year period, okay? So we still had a few years left on paying off those old supplemental COLAs, in those green box dollars. The other item in those green box dollars, again, a special appropriation, again, all these funding sources come together to make sure that we pay normal cost and pay off our unfunded liability, is for sick leave, and specifically sick leave as salary credit. And again, I think most are aware that when teachers retire, school districts have the option of compensating them for their unused sick leave at 30% of their daily rate in a lump sum payment. That's under statute. Under statute, TRS is also required to acknowledge that payment and their last annual salary for their retirement calculation purposes. And the cost of that sick leave as salary credit is something by statute that is paid by the state. So those are the two items that we had in the green box dollars. Now, something happened with this session, and that is the General Assembly appropriated $479 million to pay off all those green box dollars. Okay, so again, we have green box dollars for one, those old COLAs, those old cost of living adjustments, and two, for a portion. And I should have been more specific about this when I was talking about it, but it's a portion of sick leave liability.
Bo, you're at a point where we have a question. Senator Thayer.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Bo. Could you, for this committee, and I apologize if you've done it before, this is only my second meeting since I was just put on the committee.
Yes, sir.
Could you tell me what the annual cost to the taxpayers of Kentucky is for sick day enhancements to retired teachers' pensions?
Yes, and that would be part of the presentation. I can cut to that right now if you'd like, sir, or
Go ahead and answer the question, please.
Yes, sir. So for sick leave, we had, for the green box dollars, that was about 1% of payroll. That includes the old COLAs too. That was about $39 million a year. And then also we have an active teacher liability as well, normal cost and liability. That's an additional 1.2%. Okay. About 0.40% of that is what's being applied to normal costs, what we're putting aside each year. So when teachers retire, with the investment income we earn on that we'll be able to pay their benefits. And then that's about $15 to $16 million a year for that. And then additionally, we have that legacy unfunded liability, which is the additional 0.80% of the 1.2%. And that's an additional about $32 million a year. So right now, going forward, what we're looking at is about 1.2% of payroll, and which in today's dollars is about $47 million a year is what will be paid, contributed for sick leave. And that's only because the General Assembly appropriated that $479 million to pay off not only $99 million in owed supplemental cost of living adjustments, but also $380 million of which was paying off retired teachers' sick leave liability. So what the Commonwealth did when they made that payment, retired all of that green box dollars. There are no more payments required of that, no more 1% of payroll for supplemental COLAs or for retired teacher sick leave liability. It's gone. We got rid of the liability that was represented by that, which was about total $479 million for both the COLAs and sick leave, gone. So we've traded that, and for sick leave, we've gone from $787 million in total liabilities once we paid off those green box dollars to $407 million in liabilities. We've gone from having the green box dollar to paying 2.2% of payroll, or about $87 million a year, to paying 1.2% of payroll, or about $47 million a year. But directly to your answer, going forward from this day, from this budget, because of that appropriation, and we got that appropriation at a very good time with the downturn in the market, and we got full funding in this budget, which we're very, very thankful for. It's great to have all that money coming in. It's great liquidity for us. It's great investment opportunities for us. But with that going forward, it's the 1.2%, and in today's dollars, $47 million a year for the sick leave liability, both normal cost and for paying off that unfunded liability. I do need to pass there's a caveat here, and this is one of the questions that we had to respond in the letter, is that there's a new benefit tier at TRS, okay? We have several benefit tiers. This is Tier 4 that started January 1st. Tier 3 limited sick leave to no more than 300 days. And I know that sounds like a lot, but we do have members who have really long careers, and they have more than 300 days at retirement. So for new members on or after July 1st, 2008, no more than 300 days. And then TRS 4, Commonwealth erected a wall against any new unfunded liabilities for these new tier members that we call TRS4 members. So everybody that's come on board since January 1st, and we've already got a bunch of them on, there's no liability for the Commonwealth for sick leave, because they don't get to use sick leave in that way, as sick leave is salary credit, with the Commonwealth has an obligation to pay for it. In fact, the Commonwealth has walled off responsibility for any new unfunded liabilities that might develop with these new TRS4 members, because that the responsibility for any unfunded liability that might develop shifts, and it goes to the members, all up to and including suspension or adjustment of benefits. Our actuaries say it's unlikely we'd have to do that, because this is a very well-funded TRS4 fund. More likely we would draw from a rainy day fund called the Stabilization Reserve Account before we would ever have to adjust benefits. But the Commonwealth, for that foundational pension and supplemental savings account, I'm not talking about health insurance now, but just for that, it's limited to 10% contribution. And that's it going forward for these new TRS4 members. Does that answer your question?
That was a
there.
long answer to a short question, but yes, you answered it. $47 million. Thank you.
Yes, sir. I apologize. I don't want to leave any background out. I make sure all the information's out there. Thank you. That really it kind of cuts to the chase on the letter. I know there's a couple more items on here. One, there was a question in the letter to which Kavanaugh McDonald responded, and Mr. Coble asked him to interject at any time if he wants to add anything to what I say or correct if I do say anything wrong. But there was, because we send our budget request over in the fall before the session. So we sent our budget for the 22 session over in the fall of 21. We did make a request of $39 million for each year for the supplemental cost of living adjustments and for the sick leave liability for retired teachers, because we didn't know what the budget was going to look like ultimately. And the budget did contain $39 million in each of the current fiscal year, the budget biennium, and the next fiscal year, the budget biennium. There's $39 million in each. And the question was, is that more than we needed now that green box dollars are paid off? And the answer to that is yes. That can be applied just to the general unfunded liability of the retirement system. So that's not lost. You know, it's there and can be applied to liabilities, just like we have all these contribution streams coming in. They all go to help pay normal costs and pay off unfunded liability, and that $78 million would be applied to the unfunded liability. And I think we addressed that there was a request for confirmation that there would be no cost for the General Assembly or the Commonwealth for these new TRS-4 members for sick leave as salary credit, and that is correct. There is no cost to the Commonwealth at all for sick leave for these new members. Kavanaugh McDonald confirmed in their letter that there would be no fee or charge or cost, built in to reflect any liability for the Commonwealth for TRS-4.
Bo, Chairman Petrie has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The $39 million that you just mentioned in each of the fiscal years, I think we had conversed about this a couple of meetings ago, maybe. That was appropriated for a particular purpose.
Yes.
But you're saying that you can reallocate or reappropriate it to a different purpose and apply it toward the unfunded liability.
Yes. So, Mr. Coble, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's, the actuary is going to look at all these income streams coming in, and that will be used to pay off the general unfunded liability. It will be applied to that, and that is in Mr. Coble and Kavanaugh McDonald's letter to the board.
Okay. Ma'am, Mr. Chairman.
Please proceed.
That's right. So my question is not exactly about the different revenue streams that are coming in that it could be applied. I'm interested in that the appropriation of $39 million each year was appropriated for a particular purpose. We good with that?
Yes.
Okay, but you're going to repurpose that money.
It will be applied to the general unfunded liability of all the benefits that are owed.
And by what authority are you repurposing that appropriation?
Well, it's, that is money coming in that...
I understand that. I'm looking for a KRS is what I'm looking for. What authority do you have to reappropriate what the General Assembly has appropriated for a particular purpose?
Well, I guess you could just say we're just going to apply that to further reduce the liability on sick leave.
And say that we did that, would that be no reappropriation at that point for a different purpose?
I'm sorry.
$39 million.
Yes, sir.
Okay. There's no appropriation to be used at this point. The $39 million is not needed for the purpose it was appropriated, correct?
It's no longer needed for the unfunded sick leave liability for retired teachers.
Okay.
It could be applied to the unfunded liability for sick leave for active teachers.
Okay, so I'm going to take it that you can give me no KRS authority by which you can legally reappropriate for a different purpose what the General Assembly has appropriated for a particular purpose.
And as I believe we discussed last time, certainly the payment of that $39 million each year, the $78 million, which was requested back in the fall before the budget was concluded, was something certainly as a policy decision of the Commonwealth. If they wanted to say, look, we feel like we made an overpayment on the $78 million for the 2 years, they could certainly make that adjustment in the next budget. That would be a policy decision for the Commonwealth.
Duly noted, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure that I'm clear, and I believe we are. The General Assembly appropriates for a particular purpose, and when it does, there's no authority by KRS by which an agency may reappropriate or repurpose that money. Otherwise, there's no point in us putting any details or purpose behind any appropriation we make. So I think we're good. It was appropriated for purpose. The purpose is no longer necessary, and there is no authority to reappropriate past the decision of the General Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bo, let me first, there's nothing normal about normal cost. I don't know why we even use that, because there's nothing normal about it. We always have, when you hire somebody, apparently with a defined benefit, the day they're hired, there's an unfunded liability created, and we start that additional money to follow them through their career, is my understanding. But on the $39 million that we were paying on retired teachers and the green box dollars, we paid that for years. Also, you have an ADAC of $46 million to pay for the teachers who are currently employed to pay for their unfunded liability, the amount above normal cost.
Well, that includes normal costs for those active teachers. That's
Okay.
normal cost and unfunded liability.
Okay, how long have we been paying that?
Quite some time. You know, those specific line items in the green box dollars have been paid, and I don't know with certainty, at least back to the 90s.
Okay, if we're paying you, we had an ADAC and we're paying you the normal cost plus unfunded liability on these teachers prior to retirement, and we've been paying it for a long time. Why, on the other hand, when they retire, we're going to pay for it again?
Okay, and I apologize. I might have gotten those backwards. So the green box dollars, which represented sick leave liability for retired teachers, has been paid back since at least the 90s, and maybe earlier. It could have even been in the 80s. The liability for active teachers, both normal cost and unfunded liability, was more recent, as my understanding, my recollection. That would have been in the 2000s, and that was part of the ADEC, that additional amount that's requested above the fixed statutory amount. Of course, at about that same time, there were several years where the full funding was not provided. The ADEC was not being provided, and it was only in 2017 that we got, not all the ADEC, but we got most of it. In 2018, we got most of it. And then 19 and 20 and 21 and 22, we were getting the full funding. But again, it's all those funding sources. The actuary is going to look at that. Those funding sources need to be sufficient to pay for, the normal cost and the unfunded liability. That unfunded liability for active retired teachers was $787 million. We were paying off that unfunded liability for the retired teachers, which was at $380 million. And $380 million of that $479 million that we received went towards just paying off that portion of the unfunded liability for retired teachers completely, just leaving the active teacher normal cost and unfunded liability to be paid.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me? This is Ed Coble from Kavanaugh McDonald.
Yeah, I
Can
was
I
looking around to
interject
see
here?
who was speaking. Yes,
I'm on the video.
okay.
Can I just add something? And Mr. Barnes has described exactly what we do and how we value sick leave. I'll interject to that. We did not start valuing sick leave within our liabilities and normal costs, like he said, until the mid 2000s. I think it was 2005 was the first valuation where we had a liability for sick leave. So we've only been doing this for the last 17 years, where it's part of the normal cost. And you have to understand, yes, normal cost is not normal, but what we're doing is in a pension plan like this, a defined benefit plan, it's unlike Social Security. We are trying to save money in a trust fund while an active member is in active status. So as a teacher is teaching, we are setting aside an amount of money for their retirement benefits when they retire. So it's accumulating while they're in active status until they get to retired status. That's when that amount is hopefully enough to cover their retirement benefits. Part of that retirement benefit is obviously a piece of it is they're using sick leave to come up with a little bit larger of a benefit than they would if they didn't have it. So that is part of the normal cost. Now, the normal cost is about 16% of pay for an active member, a non-university active member.
Would you
So we're
repeat that
talking-
again?
It's about 6. Yeah, I'm sorry. We've got weather
You
here,
broke up
so
again.
Apologize if I keep coming in and out.
Okay, so please repeat
Sorry.
that.
Okay. So I apologize. We're having some weather here in Atlanta. So part of that, so the total normal cost that we're saving for each active member in the non-university group is about 16% of pay each year. Now, a member is paying a portion of that. They're paying their employee contributions. What's left is the employer. So that 0.4% is a very small piece of that 16% that we're saving while the teacher is in active service. But there is a benefit that we're trying to value when they get to retirement status. So that's the 0.4%. And as Bo said, in our letter states, that's about $15.7 million in today's dollars. Now, TRS-4 has no more, those active teachers coming onto the rolls now will not have the ability to use their sick leave as part of their benefits. So that number is going to decrease as a percentage of pay. And you see in the letter that the dollar amount drops pretty significantly over the next 30 years as we have more and more TRS-4 active teachers. So we don't have to set aside, it's not going to be in their normal cost. It's only going to be in TRS-3 and previous other tiers. So I just wanted to interject there and just kind of hopefully clarify that. Now, the green box dollars were for retirees that, came into the rolls well before 2005, where we weren't putting aside money during their active status. So we had to set up a little bit of a fund as to cover their piece of liability due to their sick leave. And that was the $40 million each year that was appropriating it. So that's paid off. That's great. And so, now we're left with just the 1.2% of payroll going forward, which is on the slide here.
Help me understand. You talk about the sick leave cost is 16% of payroll, but then we're contributing 1.2% and 0.4% normal cost. That's clear as mud to me. So would you please explain that?
I'll try to clear up the mud. So right now, KTRS has a trust fund set up of about, and again, I'm going back to 2021 numbers, so a little bit maybe of a better time, but we had a trust fund set up of in the area of $25 billion. Well, liability for all of the retirees and active members that have accrued a benefit is about $40 million. So there's a portion that is unfunded, and Bo mentioned the unfunded liability. It was about $17 billion in the last valuation that we valued. So again, we're making a contribution similar to paying off that mortgage. We're trying to pay off that $17 billion. We're a portion, again, another portion of that $17 billion that has been accrued to date for those active teachers who we didn't start, who started before 05, and we weren't as part of their normal costs, we don't have enough money right now to in the bank to cover that portion of their sick leave. And it's an estimate, but our estimate is that that portion is about $408 million, $407 million, as Bo mentioned earlier. So that's the portion of the unfunded that we're trying to pay back. So in our letter, that's the second column there that we're paying back over a 22.9 year period, where it starts at 30 million and it grows to 31 and goes all the way up. But our anticipation is it's similar to a mortgage. You're going to be paying that off over the next 22 or so years. So that's the portion that is not currently funded with assets of the sick leave liabilities. The rest is covered.
Okay, I'll ask you a quick question, and we've got several others that want to jump in. If we paid off the $408 million, hypothetically, we would never hear from you again about sick leave liability, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. It would just be part of the normal cost, which is decreasing.
Okay. Representative Tipton has questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bo, always appreciate you being here and your indulgence with us. On the ADEC, I'm looking at the appendix to the letter that was sent by the your actuary. And of course, it does show that as he just mentioned, that the normal costs are going to decrease. The cost for the unfunded liability is going to increase, and the total net cost is going to increase about $10 million over this period per year. Now, this 2040, when this last payment, is that consistent with our unfunded liability on all of our pensions?
Yes.
Is that about the time period they're going to be, that portion is going to be paid off?
Yes, sir. I would just point out that the 2040 is the valuation year, and the
Okay.
fiscal year end is 2043. But yes,
Okay.
all those liabilities are on target to be paid off at the
I'm
same
with
time.
you now. I'm with you now. I was looking at the wrong column. How many different components? You mentioned this is 1.2% of the ADEC. How many different components are there to the ADEC that make up that total number?
Well, you have, and I'm going to let Mr. Coble jump in here, but just briefly, and I'll let him jump in.
Sure.
But you have the normal cost, of course, for all these benefits, whether it's pension, disability, life insurance. Even though life insurance is small, there are a lot of things that add liability, and I believe Mr. Coble would say that they look at those in total and come up with total liabilities and those contribution streams we need from any sources, the ones I just named, coming in to pay normal cost and the unfunded liability off that amortization period, 30 now 22 years. Mr. Coble, do you have anything to correct or add to that?
Yeah. No, you got to remember the reason for having this pension system is to pay retirement benefits. So the majority of this pool of assets is going to pay retirement benefits, but it also is paying disability benefits. Remember, it's not trying to set aside all of that. Those folks who leave the system before retirement, they're entitled to a benefit sometime in the future. So there's 5 or 6 components of a benefit that a member is receiving, but the majority is retirement benefits, obviously.
And my question was leading to a request. And I hope Chairman Petrie won't mind me making this request, but in the future, when your system sends us the ADEC number, would it be possible to categorize each of these components so we have a clear understanding of where exactly the money's being going toward, to help us understand how much is going toward sick leave, how much is going toward each component? Personally, I think that would be a great benefit. So I just wanted to throw that out there and see if that was possible information we could have in the forward years when you send those ADEC requests. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Bo, I'd hate to keep asking this. Looking at the sheet, I'm trying to add in my head how much this on the sheet that we got of the payoff schedule for that unfunded liability for sick days. I'm thinking that's about $1 billion if I add correctly.
The unfunded liability for sick leave.
The payback, what we're
Oh,
paying
the
back.
payback, the
over-
payback.
Over 20 years. So
Uh,
if that's correct, and we owe 408 million, are we paying interest to TRS on that accrued liability that we really haven't, it's there, are we paying interest on it?
It's that, I don't know what Mr. Coble addressed, but I think that may just be a
Yes.
function of payroll growth as much as anything else. But
It's so just like any mortgage, you're paying interest on that as well. So you have a unfunded of $408 million for sick leave. If you paid it all at once, $408. If you're paying it over a 23-year period or so, for a 20-year period, you're going to be paying some interest component of it. So, so that's embedded in here and as well. So I think it comes out to a little bit less than half than the 400 million. A little bit less than double. I'm sorry, than the 400, but $800 million if you were to pay it over a 20-year period.
Okay, I have a feeling Representative Petrie is probably going to ask you for a breakdown on those sick day ADAC when we get the next request, because again, it's clear as mud, and we've all of us have asked many questions about sick leave, and it's very difficult to understand, and a lot of the information we had to ask for. So I'd like to see an explanation. I'm sure he'll. I don't have to ask. Representative Petrie and Senator McDaniel will be at your asking that. Senator Thayer has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to clarify, is sick day spiking required by statute, or is it currently just a policy adopted by the TRS board in the late 1990s?
no, this sick leave actually it's a statute that's within the Kentucky Department of Education range of statutes, and it was enacted, I believe, in the early 1980s. And so it's statutory, and what it provides is that the school districts they don't have to, but they may compensate those retiring teachers at 30% of the daily rate. All have chosen to do so.
I'm not talking about the 30% payout. That's
Right.
That's SOP. I mean, even the military does that. I'm talking about using unused sick days
Yes.
for pension enhancement
That's also in that same statute.
in that same statute.
Yes,
But it
sir.
is outside the inviolable contract,
Yes,
correct?
sir. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to clarify. Again, new to the committee, wanted to get that on the record. Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Okay, not to wear this beat this horse to death, but I still have a couple more questions for you, Bo. All right, we have the green box dollars we've been paying for years, and we now know that we have an ADAC that we've been paying since 2006, 2005, I believe was a comment. Have we overpaid or paid for this twice? It seems like I'm confused, because until we started asking about green box dollars and looking at paying those off, I don't know that anybody on the committee understand that we had all this other liability and these other payments on top of just the green box dollars. No, I don't think any of us understood that. I know I didn't. So that was news to me. So I just like that. The question is, have we overpaid?
No, I mean, it is unusual that we've had two streams of payments coming in. We've had the ADAC payments more recently, and we've had the specific green box dollar request. You had that total outstanding liability of $787 million that was getting paid through those two income streams, just like all the benefits provided by TRS have more than one income contribution stream. whether it's, again, employer contribution, that fixed rate or fixed statutory contribution rate for employee, all those come together have to be sufficient to pay off normal cost and the unfunded liability. So those two streams of payment were doing that. They were paying normal cost and paying off the unfunded liability that's owed, which is a total of $787 million. And with the green box dollar payoff, we've eliminated $380 million of that sick leave unfunded liability and are down to $407 million. So, no, those are being applied to pay normal costs and unfunded liability or liabilities of sick leave, and they're being applied exactly as they should be, dollar for dollar.
Okay. Thank you on that. And one final question, and we've talked about this at a previous meeting about sick days in general, and that we have some school systems that are allowing personal days that are awarded to staff annually, that unused personal days and unused annual leave are getting reported to TRS as sick days. And I read the KRS on that, and I don't see how that's possible that we could take something that was intended as a leave and personal days, that we can turn those into sick days.
Well, you're right. There are districts that are kind of, doing different things with personal leave days, but some of them are converting unused unused personal days. They get converted to sick leave days. The same thing happens, for example, in state government. State employees with 20 or more years of service can carry 60 annual leave days over every year, but by personnel cabinet regulation, any days in excess of 60 at the end of the calendar year have to be converted to sick leave. And I think probably those regulations apply to districts too about, well, I'm not going to say that. I shouldn't say that. I can speak for I know what state government it has. So it's not uncommon, that you have unused annual days roll over to sick days. But I don't know enough of the specifics about what every district is doing out there or what authority they have under, Department of Education statutes.
I think that's something I would assume and that somebody knows how that's coming about, because when you convert a personal day to a sick day and they use that to spike their pension, it costs the district very little. And it costs the state, it's a considerable cost to the state when that happens. So I think we need to dig into that a little further. But in your opinion, does the current KRS allow for that to happen?
I think probably you need to look at the school district statutes about their compensation and how they can compensate their employees, and whether or not personal days are allowed to be rolled over into sick leave. Again, I know, for example, state government, state employees have annual days in excess of 60 roll over by law. So it's a little bit, that's outside my bailiwick. We have those days reported to us as sick days, and by statute, we're required to use sick leave days, that 30% payment that we receive on sick days, add that to their last year's salary. Well,
again, I think it would be, as an oversight committee, to insist that TRS know exactly what's going on out there as those sick days come to us. As they're intended for one thing, but we're using them for something else, or vice versa. They're not. Personal days were not intended to be sick days and to be used towards your retirement, the way I read the statute. So, again, that's something that your actuary and yourself, we would like to know more about that as we move forward. I think that's all that I have. If you want any other questions from, okay, Bo, please.
Yes, sir.
You can move on to your next item.
I was just making a note there, sir, about your question. Okay, our next item that we have up is the provisions under which retiring members may return to work for a TRS employer. So I'll just refer to these as return to work provisions, return to work. And first, we do get, it's a fair question, why do we even have provisions, under which retiring members can return to work for a TRS employer? Why were there any provisions at all? Well, first, it allows school districts to address staffing needs by using retired teachers, but by accomplishing, in doing so, by making sure we accomplish two critically important goals. And the first goal is that we want to make sure that return to work provisions are done in an actually sound manner. When teachers retire and return to work, it's actuarially sound. And it has not always been that way. And by example, I would say before 2002, teachers could retire, return immediately to the classroom, work up to 100 days, and receive full salary. So it wasn't taking long for teachers to realize that, hey, by retiring now, drawing my pension, and getting full salary, I can make 118% about what I'm making now, more, significantly more, and only work 100 days. That looks like a pretty good deal. And I remember specifically, because I was there, the Educational Professional Standards Board asked us to look at the numbers, because then teachers could retire at any age with 27 years of service, theoretically, graduate from college 22, retire 49. Educational Professional Standards Board asked us to look at how many teachers, the trend of teachers retiring over the last several years with exactly 27 years of service and going back in that 100-day program. Well, this trend was spiking up sharply because they just made too much sense. 118% of pay, working, not 185 days, but 100, it was too attractive. So the return to work provisions were tightened up in 2002, so they became actuarially sound. Okay, and they were done in a number of ways, and I'm going to focus just real quickly on those. One, because our prior legacy tiers, tiers 1, 2, and 3 have unfunded liability, teachers going back to work, there's contributions that are still being made in those positions to help us with that unfunded liability. Also, there are limitations. There are limitations on, for example, the number of full-time positions available for retired teachers to go back into. These aren't really an issue, which a few slides later on I'll discuss why that's not, but it's important that we did have limitations on how many full-time positions there are, and that the part-time positions, there's a limitation on the number of days they can work. Essentially, it's 0.69 of a contract year. And then also, very, very importantly, there's a limitation on the salary that they can earn now when they return to work for a TRS employer in a TRS position. We didn't have that with the 100-day program, but we have that now. If they retire 30 more years of service, they can return at 75% of their last annual compensation. If they retire less than 30 years of service, it's 65% of their last annual compensation. So very important, and that has helped us actuarially because we now have a system where we're getting back to where people are retiring closer to age 60 than age 50. So we avoid paying out benefits, pension, and medical years earlier than we otherwise would. So actuarially, the actuarial goal has to be maintained when we are talking about return to work provisions. The very important, critically important consideration is that we maintain compliance with federal tax law. TRS is a qualified plan under Section 401A of the Internal Revenue Code. And what that means is that teachers make contributions to TRS on a tax-deferred basis, more take-home pay in their paycheck, a very important tax advantage that we haven't always had, but we have now and we want to preserve. And in regard to that, what we've got to do is the IRS, was the compliance agency on federal tax law compliance. The IRS is looking to ensure that retirement systems only pay retirement benefits when there's been a legitimate retirement event. The member has actually retired, and they would call it a bona fide retirement. They have a bona fide retirement, and that retirement system does not allow retirement benefits to be paid while that member is still employed. Okay, so that is the direction they have given us. And they don't give us a lot of other direction about what works and what ensures a bona fide retirement. But they do say that we have to have a bona fide retirement, and that's the one thing they say we have to have. And the one key thing with having a bona fide retirement is there can be cannot be a prearranged agreement between that retiring employee and the employer for that retiring employee to go back to work for that employer. That is one thing that the IRS has expressly said is not a bona fide retirement. So if you have something that allows members to receive retirement benefits without having bona fide retirement, the retirement system is subjected to disqualification as a 401A plan. Therefore, our members could go back to making contributions after tax, and that member subjects themselves to tax penalties for having an in-service distribution. So very important that we are compliant with federal tax law. How do we show the IRS that we are tax compliant, that we do have bona fide retirements? A couple of ways. One, we require retiring members and their employer to attest that there's no prearranged agreement for that retiring member to return to work for the employer. That's one thing we do. The second thing we do is something that many pension plans do across the nation, and that is we require break in service from the time that that member retires before they can return to work. Now, the IRS hasn't said that works, much less if they said what length of break in service is sufficient, but we do feel, because the IRS really, other than no prearranged agreements and all facts and circumstances analysis that they do, whether or not there's been a bona fide retirement, do about feeling there's a break in service between retirement and going back in the classroom, that helps demonstrate good faith to the IRS that there has been a bona fide retirement. So that's why we have these return to work provisions. First, just so for comparison, I'm going to start with what the permanent return to work provisions are. These are the ones that were enacted in 2002. They are codified in statute where they remain today. And we have, looking at the slide in front of you, we have on the left, we have the type of return to work program that we're going to be addressing. And to the right, we're going to have what those permanent rules are for that program. So starting on the first row, upper left, and you'll see part-time and full-time. This is our what I'll call standard return to work program. Overwhelmingly, retired teachers go back to work under this standard retired return to work program. And what is that program? What does it require? The breaks in service are required, whether part-time or full-time. That retiring member, if they're going back, that retired member, if they're going back part-time for the same or a different employer, they are required to have a 3-month break in service. If they go back to work full-time for the same employer, it's a 12-month break in service. If they go back to work for a different employer full-time, it's a 3-month break in service. So basically, a different employer, whether part-time or full-time, 3-month break. It's going back to the same employer, part-time, 3-month break, full-time, 12-month break. There are also day limits. You're going back part-time, 0.69 of a year. There's a limited number of full-time positions available. It's equivalent that to the employers school districts can have no more than 3% of their full-time TRS employees. No more than 3% can be retirees. Okay, that's not an issue for districts. I have a slide that'll show that in a little bit, but it is good to have a limit in there. And also very important are those wage limitations in our standard return to work program that, again, is the predominant program. And again, that's 75% and 65% of salary, last annual compensation measured on a daily basis. Now, there's another program they can go back in. There's actually two more. One's waiver. They waive their retirement allowance and go back, not receive a retirement allowance. Not many people use that. But the other one is critical shortage. It's called critical shortage. And those are the bottom two rows of this slide. And there are critical shortage part-time and full-time programs. These are available only for school districts, not other TRS employers. And their intent is to be able to allow these school districts to incentivize retirees to come back in those hard-to-fill teaching positions they just can't find anybody else for. And they do that. You still have the breaks in service of 3 months or 12 months, depending on how they're going back and who they're going back for. But there is no limitation on their salary. That school district can pay them any salary they want to. Now, there is, under the permanent laws, a limited number of these positions available. And under those permanent laws that are still codified in statute, districts can have no more than 1% of their full-time TRS employees in the critical shortage program. but every district gets at least 2 critical shortage programs because some districts are too small or so small that 1%, would be less than 1. So there is a limitation on those critical shortage programs. Hiring people into critical shortage is clearly, or hiring any retiree into even the standard program, clearly the discretion of the school district. They don't have to hire anybody back. They don't have to any retirees back, and they don't have to hire them into the critical shortage program. Some of our members feel like they have a right to be rehired in the critical shortage program, but that's clearly the employer's discretion to do that. So those were the permanent codified statutory provisions, but those provisions have been amended over the past year, most recently with House Bill 1, the budget bill, enacted during the 2022 regular session, and it made temporary adjustments to those provisions. And we certainly understand the hardship that school districts have in recruiting teachers right now. We read about it in the paper all the time. And there's been a lot of confusion about what these temporary provisions are. So TRS, we're working as hard as we can to help employers and our members understand what those temporary provisions are and what they allow. And these provisions are unlike the permanent provisions. They're not codified in statute. They're non-codified language.
Well, we have a question, if you don't mind. Representative Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I guess 2 or 3 questions here, if it's all right, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Have you seen many teachers in this temporary provisions? Have there been many retired teachers, or y'all have the numbers on that who have looked into this and are going back to work compared to the normal provisions?
I have a slide with some numbers, particularly on the critical shortage provisions. There's several moving pieces here.
Okay,
but,
you can get to that when you get to it. And now it's my understanding that in your guidance on return to work, that per advice of your outside tax counsel, that TRS will be reporting retirees to the IRS as potential in-service distribution if they're under 59.5. Is that correct information?
That is correct.
Is this just for the temporary provisions or for all employees returning to work?
No. So certainly we have the temporary provisions provide for a shorter break in service. To kind of jump ahead, it's 1 month instead of the respective 3 or 12 months. And public pension plans, some across the country, do have a 1 month break in service, and the IRS has not said there's anything wrong with that. But our tax counsel is looking at this. Of course, 1 month is less than the summer break that a teacher has. So they advised to make sure that if you want to be careful to protect the status of TRS as a qualified planner, Section 401A, and show good faith to the IRS, we could report this as an in-service distribution if they are under 59.5, if they only have a 1 month break in service. If they're 59.5 or over, or they observe the traditional permanent 3 or 12 month breaks in service, they will not be reported so. Now, just because they're reported that way doesn't mean that they have to file that way. I mean, they can file their taxes, in the winter, in February, as not having had an in-service distribution. That is the decision that they have, an option.
Have you received a lot of questions from members concerned about the advice of the information you shared with them?
Not a lot of feedback. There's been some. But talking to our staff and the call center, not a lot about this, interestingly, but volume may increase. A lot of this is new for our members, and they're still trying to understand what these provisions are and what they allow. And again, there's been a lot of misunderstanding about what is and isn't allowed.
We're all aware of the reason this was initially included in language in special session in
Yes,
House
sir.
Bill 1. We've got a shortage of teachers.
Yes, sir.
And we're
There's
trying
no
to
doubt.
get qualified teachers in the classroom.
Yes, sir.
It's my understanding that TRS and KPPA have the same outside tax counsel. Is that correct?
I do not know. Our tax counsel is Ice Miller out of Indianapolis. They are a large law firm that specializes in retirement issues, public and private sector, for retirement systems, public and private across the nation.
I'll verify that when Mr. Eager gets up here. And the reason for that question is, in KPPA, for a full-time hazardous duty position, they have the same 1 month break for hazardous duty positions in KPPA. So I was just curious if it's my understanding it's the same tax council. So I'm trying to understand if it is the same council tax or the systems getting conflicting information, conflicting advice.
No, I would say not, just for the reason that they pointed out to us that, a 1 month break is less than the summer break, for a school district-based retirement system. So there are a lot of differences between TRS and KPPA, and for that reason, things aren't always done exactly the same, quite often are not.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Please proceed.
Yes, sir. Okay, so again, this TRS realizes clearly there's a huge teacher shortage issue, in the Commonwealth, and it's a real problem. And again, we were trying to communicate to our members to help them understand what these temporary provisions are. The first temporary provision was Senate Bill 1 in the special session last September. Then we had Senate Bill 25 earlier on in the regular session, or the 2022 session. And then ultimately House Bill 1 was enacted at the end of the 2022 regular session. And sort of built upon, House Bill 1 kind of builds upon the earlier versions with one, there's one very significant difference between House Bill 1 and the earlier Senate Bill 1 and Senate Bill 25 is that those earlier bills applied only to members who retired on or before August 1st of 2021. So the special session, of course, was in September, so it applied to people who had already retired only. House Bill 1 does not have that August 1 date. It applies to people who've already retired as well as to people who will retire over the next 2 years. So it's a significant difference between House Bill 1 and earlier bills. Also, the earlier bills dealt with KPPA in addition to TRS, and House Bill 1 just deals with TRS. And so for that reason, it applies only to local school districts. These temporary measures only for local school districts. Temporary relaxes certain these return to work provisions, and the provisions, these temporary provisions of House Bill 1 revert back to the permanent statutory provisions because they sunset June 30th, 2024. So after June 30th, 2024, we go back to only the permanent statutory provisions that are available. Okay, whoops. Okay. I apologize. So my screen is cut off, so I can't see fully on the laptop. So again, there's been a lot of misunderstanding, and we're still trying to clarify that. It's important for our retirees to know that these return to work provisions, whether permanent or temporary, apply whether or not they're going into a certified or a classified position. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're not going back into a TRS position. So what are the temporary provisions? And I've kind of already discussed that the biggest change is instead of those 3 and 12-month breaks, there's a 1 month break in service, okay? Regardless of how you're going back, whether you're going back in the standard return to work program with those wage limitations, part-time, full-time, whether or not you're going in the critical shortage program, part-time, full-time, just a 1 month break in service is all that is needed. There's something additionally that House Bill 1 does that the previous 2 bills during the last year did, and that is it increases the number of critical shortage positions available from 1% of your active full-time TRS employees, or at least 2 critical shortage positions per district, to 10%. Okay, it increases that from 10%. Now we're not seeing as much impact with that as we might have thought. And again, this goes away July 1st, 2024. But and I have a slide that's going to talk a little bit more about how frequently these critical shortage positions are being used. But the 1 to 10% has less impact, and the 1 month will have a bigger impact. Okay, and very importantly, and this is regardless of whether you're going back under the permanent statutory provisions or you're going back under these temporary non-codified positions. If you are a reciprocity retiree, That means you, retired with service in more than one retirement system. For example, you retired with service in TRS and County Employees Retirement System, like many of our members have. You need to observe the return to work provisions for all retirement systems you retired with, service with. So it's very important. We tell and we message to those reciprocity employees, all our members, make sure you check with CERS and us before you return to work, and make sure that you are complying with all the return to work provisions, including their required breaks in service. Because again, House Bill 1 is unlike the previous two bills, Senate Bill 1, Senate Bill 25, and applies to TRS only, not KPPA. So they need to contact KPPA because they might have a longer break in service at KPPA, and they need to observe that before returning to work for a school district. This is pretty much just a repeat of what was on the last slide, so I won't really spend any time on it, but it's just to emphasize that, the increase is from 1% to 10%. And again, employers are not required to hire retirees into the critical shortage programs. That is completely discretionary with the school district. Okay, this slide, we get into a little bit more of how these new temporary provisions are being used. And this is the critical shortage program only. The box there, the gray box at the top, I'm going to go to it. This is critical shortage positions only, again, where the school district can pay them anything they want to. There's no wage limitation. Under the original permanent statutory return to work provisions, there were 622 critical shortage positions allowed statewide. 34 of those were being used, or 5.47% of all the available critical shortage positions were being used. Under the temporary program, we've raised that from 1%, or at least 2 positions per district, to 10%. Now there are 5,423 critical shortage positions available statewide. 178 of those are being used, or 3.8% of all available critical shortage positions are being used currently. Now, going on down to the gray box below that one, just some more data about how critical shortage is being used. You'll see the line total number of employers, 172. That's 172 school districts. 125 of the 172 school districts are not using the critical shortage program. So 73% of school districts are not using the critical shortage program. And even more significantly, the number of employers that are exceeding the old critical shortage limitation of 1% or 2 per district under these new temporary provisions are there only 6 districts that are exceeding the old limitation. So that's 3% of the employers are using, or only 3% of the employers are exceeding the original critical shortage allocations or limitations, and that translates into a small number of teachers that are bringing back they feel they really need. Something else I want to point out here, and there's some text underneath that bottom gray box, and you'll see it starts out of the 1,638, and this is full-time positions under the permanent standard return to work program with that wage limitation, the predominant return to work program where people are subject to a wage limitation. There are, with that 3% cap, 1,638 full-time positions available, but only 175 of those 1,638 positions are actually being used by retired teachers. 11% of those available, only 11% of the available positions are being used. So what that tells us is teachers are not going back full-time, and employers are not hiring them back full-time. They're going back part-time. And that's going to be mostly going back part-time in substitute teaching positions. Again, this is just to highlight that the temporary changes that we have in the non-codified language in House Bill 1 sunset June 30th, 2024. At that point, we go back to the original permanent statutory provisions, the 1% limitation on critical shortage, for example, or 2 positions per district. The one thing that doesn't sunset, doesn't change. If someone goes back now, for example, they retire, they sit out a month, and then they go back to work before June 30th, 2024, and they met that 1 month and break, after June 30th, 2024, they've met their break-in service forever. They don't have to go back and meet the additional 3 or 12-month break-in service. They get to keep the 1-month break. This is very important. We get a lot of questions about this because there are a lot of members and even some employers have under the impression that a lot of things changed. More things changed than actually did. And this slide shows bullet point by bullet point, what doesn't change. And again, I know I've said this before, but it's worth repeating. I know we had an employer out there supposedly offering retiring members the opportunity to come back to work, but the IRS says you cannot have a prearranged agreement for retiring members to come back to work after retirement, whether it's a certified or classified position. You cannot have that prearranged agreement. Retirees returning in our standard, predominant.
We're getting short on time.
Yes, sir.
And I know you got financials to go through. We have all that. Just give us Cliff Notes versions on that, and we can look at it. It's
Okay.
It's in our packet. I want to make sure we have time to go over your financials.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'll speed through these. Again, and I'll leave 2 things here. One, if the reciprocity retiree was serviced in more than one retirement system, make sure you call all retirement systems you have service in before you go back to work. 2, also, if you're going back to work for a school district and you can get health insurance through them or any other employer, you get health insurance through that employer, you have to drop your active your TRS retiree insurance and get that active employer insurance. We advise our members to call well ahead of time to make sure we can make a smooth transition with changing insurance back and forth. These are just the website. We have videos and we have summaries of these return to work provisions and what they do. And now, let's see. This last slide, we have 70,198 full-time and part-time members eligible to retire as of June 30th, 2022. We have 73,198 full-time and part-time members as of June 30th, 2022. Eligible to retire 8,890 or 12.15%. Just some data. So investment performance, and this is for fiscal year in 2022. It's a reminder always, TRS is a long-term investor. We have a long-term horizon. We don't get too worried about quarters or even year or few years. We look for the long term. That's because we're a long-term investor. These are, this slide shows unaudited returns as of June 30th, 2022. 2021 was an exceptional year with nearly 30% returns, and as we talked about it then, it was exceptional. You're not going to see that every year. It's the highest return we've ever had. Well, 2022 has been an interesting year in its own right. We've had a lot of things going on. We've had supply chain issues. We've had inflation, particularly oil. We've had the Fed response to inflation with raising interest rates. We've had Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've had China opening and reopening and closing again. We've had fears about recession. So a lot of uncertainty in the market over this last year, and that's reflected in the returns on this slide. And I'm going to focus on the bottom 2 rows, starting with the bottom row. It shows returns for the quarter and various year periods. Net returns for TRS, and this is for the Retirement Annuity Trust. The Health Insurance Trust is next. So the bottom left-hand corner, net return negative 10.28%. Our rating for that was top 79% in the nation compared to other large public pension plans, lower than normal. Again, this is a quarter return. The difference here really is TRS. We invest in private equity, but we have less private equity than a lot of the other public pension plans. Private equity fared better for this quarter, for this year.
Oh, let me ask you on that. It's a number I don't usually see. Top 79%. Does that mean only 21% performed worse than?
Yes, sir.
So
yes.
That's not a real good number there.
No, it's a short-term number.
Okay.
It is a short-term number.
Just one. That's the way I was reading it. I just want to make sure I wasn't reading it incorrectly.
And again, that's largely, we have private equity. It's less than 10%. Some other pension plans have a larger allocation to private equity, and it just happened to be an asset class that was more in favor this past year. That does not mean that the assets that TRS has are bad assets. What it reflects is that, as is typical with the market, as we've seen throughout history, in certain years, certain asset classes fare better than others. It doesn't mean it's a bad asset. Some years stocks do bad. Sometimes domestic stocks do worse than international, vice versa. It doesn't mean it's a bad investment. It just means for that time period, did not do as well. Next year, it can turn completely around, and the asset class that did poorly this past year can do very well the next year. So 1 year, you're going to see the same thing, a negative 10.89%, top 79%. 3 years out, 6.8% return, top 45%. 5-year return, 7.29% return, top 34%. 10-year, 8.5% return, top 17%. 20-year, 6.96% return. We don't have comparative measures for that period of time. In the blue box at the bottom, you'll see the 30-year compounded gross return is 7.75% for the 30-year period. So I always say that is a gross return. It doesn't net out administrative expenses, but administrative expenses now are very low, about 0.30 of 1 percentage point, maybe a little bit more than that. But even going back that far before we got into international equity and private equity, they were really cheap. Our administrative expenses were very low. So 30-year compounded gross return will be very close to that 7.75%, maybe very close. And again, markets go up, markets go down. This July's been very good, and it's been very good for TRS. Looks like we're going to be up about 5% just in that 1 month, offsetting half of that negative 10%. Don't have a crystal ball. Don't know what the coming months are going to hold for us. Don't know if we're in the start of a rebound. It's not atypical to see a rebound, some rebound after a really bad year, but just don't know yet. But, we do like seeing what looks to be about a 5% return in July as we bounce back some. This is the same slide, but for the health insurance trust. Again, just kind of focusing on the bottom two rows, negative 10.47% for the return for the quarter. Negative 9.67% for 1 year, 6.62% for 3 year, 6.9% 5 year, 7.24% for 10 year. And you can see how we fared against, the benchmark, the average benchmark for those investments. You all have those, and Mr. Co-Chair, for given time, I'll pass on to the next slide because we still have cash flow left and asset allocation. Okay, this slide reflects cash flow as for the fiscal year ending 2022, and this is for the retirement annuity trust. We're going to have an identical or similar slide for the health insurance trust after this one. And as I always point out, this slide, you can kind of divide it in thirds. The top third reflects cash inflows, money coming in. The middle third is cash outflows, and the bottom third is largely shows the result, not solely, but mostly of those cash inflows and outflows. It includes more than that, but you'll see the results of that. And with this, on the right-hand side column, we have fiscal year 2021, so we can compare that to the next column over fiscal year 2022. And I'll start at the top line, cash inflows. You will see that member contributions from 21 to 22 increased from $327,800,000 to $354,600,000. Employer contributions increased from $1,147,000,000 to $1,688,200,000. That's largely due, of course, to the additional $479 million that was received at the end of the fiscal year in payment of the green box dollars. Also, investment income, and again, investment income, that's stock dividends and interest earned on bonds is what we're talking about there. That increased from $253,600,000 to $354,200,000 for fiscal year 22. So overall cash inflows increased from $1.7 billion, you see there, to $2.3 billion, almost $2.4 billion for the 2 fiscal years. And that finishes the top third, cash inflows. Going to the middle third, cash outflows. We have benefit payments. The top line there is benefit payments refunds. This is mostly benefit payments. It's retirement allowances going out. $2,260,600,000 in 21, increased to $2,332,600,000 fiscal year 22. That's a cash outflow, of course, the biggest one. We also have administrative expense, $12,600,000 for fiscal year 21. $13,500,000 for fiscal year 22. That increases in administrative expense, and TRS does strive to keep administrative expenses among the lowest in the nation. That increase is due almost solely to implementing that new benefit tier that was enacted in 2021, building that into our IT system. It's very complicated. It requires assistance of an outside IT firm helping program in all the variables that occur with a new benefit tier that is really a lot different than the existing benefit tier. So staff spend a lot of time on this, and we need a lot of outside expert assistance to help us build in this new plan, at which point that cost will not recur. So outflows, $2,273,200,000 for 2021, increasing somewhat to $2,346,100,000 for 2022. Now we get to the bottom third of this slide, and this shows the top line there is going to show cash flow. And as I always say, this doesn't tell the whole story about the health of the trust, because in addition to these cash flows and cash outflows, the size of the trust also grows depending upon just the gains or losses in value over the year. The stocks increase in value, the size of the trust increases. That's not stock interest or stock dividends or interest or bond interest. That's something else outside of that. So even though you can have negative cash flow, for example, you can still see the size of the trust increase because just the value of the assets have increased. So, but for this year, we saw a negative 500, or for last year, we saw a negative 544,800,000 cash flow. Okay. And again, our actuaries have said that is within a reasonable range, at that level, given the size of our assets, and it is manageable for us now. And that's what our investment staff tell us, that they can now invest because we're getting enough money in, and we're very thankful for that, with the additional appropriations since 2017 to fully fund the pension fund. This year, given that $479 million additional dollars coming in, which again is a great time to receive that money. Down the market, you want to buy low, sell high. We can really put that money to work, that liquidity to work, during this down market. We saw not a negative cash flow, but a positive cash flow of $50,900,000. So all in, below that, we see what happens just with the assets, gains and losses, how they increase or decrease in value. Of course, last year with that amazing return, historically unique return in 2021, we saw gains in retirement annuity assets of $5,763,600,000. This year, of course, after the slides I just went over, the negative 10% return, we saw a decline in value of assets of $3,087,400,000. That doesn't mean we lost that money. That means there has been a decline in the value of the assets. It's only a loss when you sell the asset when it's low. Right now, we have liquidity. Again, thank you for the $479 million to be able to invest.
Representative Timpson has a question. If you don't mind.
Yes, sir.
Real quick question, and this is in honor of our former co-chair, Representative Duplessis, who's not here today, because if he were here, he would ask this question.
Yes, sir.
And you probably know where I'm going. He liked to talk about that negative cash
Yes, sir.
flow. So it's fair to say without the $479 million, and it's $479.2 million, that was infused into TRS, there would have been a sizable negative cash flow in this year's allocation, correct?
Yes, sir. There would have been, yes. It would be the 479 minus the 50.
So about negative 429. He would want to ask that, and since he wasn't here, I wanted to point that out. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome.
And then to conclude on this slide, I'm just going to focus on the bottom two numbers and the second column to the left, representing numbers for, start and end of fiscal year 2022. That top number, we started the fiscal year July 1st, 2021. We started with assets in the retirement annuity trust of $25,935,800,000. With the decline in the market, the paper value of those assets are down to $22,899,300,000. And again, we have to remember that these are short-term numbers. July alone looks to be 5%. Don't know what the future holds, but we're a long-term investor. And we want to, as long as we have those long-term returns, which we have had historically, that's where we need to be. That's where we want to be. Going to the next slide, this is the same format slide, but instead for the retirement annuity trust, this is for the health insurance trust. And again, it's divided into thirds, top thirds cash inflow. You see an increase in member contributions, and I'll round these off, $187 million in 21 to $205 million, 22. Decrease in employer contributions, $184 million in 21 to $141 million in 22. Recovery income, and that is pharmaceutical rebates, federal subsidies that we recover. Spend a lot of time doing that, trying to recover money to help pay the cost of the benefit. $120 million in 2021, and increase that somewhat to $145 million in 2022. Investment income, again, stock dividends and interest on bonds, $6.7 million to $13.4 million comparing the two periods. So total cash inflows increased somewhat from $499 million in 21 to $505 million in 2022. Cash outflows, we see benefits declining somewhat here from $310,900,000 to $306,800,000. Administrative expense up slightly, $1,700,000 to $1,800,000. My recollection is that we were a little short on staff last year in our health insurance department. They spent a lot of time not just answering members' questions, but keeping track of the recovery income, the rebates, and the subsidies. So we had to replace some staff, I believe, is the reason for that increase. Net cash flow, again, this fund, it's a new fund. It was established in 2010. It's been cash flow positive from the beginning. We see $187,300,000 in 21. Increasing to $196,600,000 fiscal year 22. Gains, losses, the value of the assets.
Bo, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but what percentage funded is the health insurance trust now?
We are at about 60. We are at about 60% now, I believe. I'll confirm that, but that is as a result of we were above that. And then we had that most recent experience study where we lowered the assumed rate of return for this fund from 8% to 7.1%. We also increased mortality to a teacher-specific mortality table. So we saw a decrease from the previous year to the fiscal year ending 2021 just because of that experience study. But we are on track with this funding coming to health insurance. Again, we had full funding for health insurance in this budget for the current biennium. We just started. We're very thankful for that. We are on track to have health insurance benefit for teachers fully funded in just a very few short years. We've got to keep our eyes on medical inflation, and TRS is constantly doing things to help keep costs down. We just changed our formulary to the same one that UK uses, but some members didn't like that because it's it didn't provide everything that the old formula did, but still a good formulary. So
but we're running short on
Okay,
time.
yes, sir.
So
this is the last slide, Mr. Chair, and that's just I'll explain. You all can look at this at your leisure if you'd like to. Don't me explain it. This is just
no, that's fine. We have a few questions and we'll wrap you up.
Okay.
I still you say it's healthy to have negative cash flow, and I know you've told me that before. On the, of course, I'm still not a firm believer in that. Negative cash flows on TRS, on your TRS return, the negative cash flow. Well, you would have had negative cash flow without the 400-some million.
Yes, sir. And negative cash flow certainly can be a bad thing.
Well,
If you have too much negative cash flows, that percentage of negative cash flow is too high in relation to the assets. And we were getting there before we got the additional funding that we're getting now that started in 2017. Our actuary was worried before then because we were getting in a bad place.
okay, where you're phasing in the assumptions, you're doing the smoothing.
On the assumed rate of return, on the 7.1%.
So are with the smoothing from the good year last year to the not so good year this year, are we above or behind on our assumptions, above or below?
And I do need to qualify that. We built in immediately the new assumptions, the 7.1% as far as liabilities. We are smoothing in our budget request on the 7.1%.
Okay, so I guess that was my question. To get to it, are you going to ask for more money if we didn't meet assumptions when you do your smoothing?
Well, it's and as the co-chairs pointed out, returns are smoothed over a 5-year period. So we will, just like that almost 30% return last year is smoothed, averaged over 30. This negative 10% return will be smoothed over 5 years. So we have good years and bad years in that period of time, and that's just constantly changing. But there are always going to be some increases based on changes and assumptions, and you will probably see some increase in health insurance. Some
One
modest
final
increase.
question, and I got to let you go unless someone else has a question. There's a lot in the news right now about proxy voting. Are you on top of that?
Yes. We have proxy voting. We use an outside firm that does a lot of services for us.
I think there's only like two firms in the country control about 90% of the proxy voting.
Yeah.
I guess you're doing business with 1 to 2.
They send us that yes, sir, ISS. They send us those proxy votes. They are reviewed internally, and they make recommendations, and then we look at those. And usually those recommendations are in line with what is good for business, what is good for the business of that company. Sometimes it's not good for the business of that company. For example, there's an attempted buyout of a company. That would look good for us because it's going to increase the value of the shares of that company. But management usually has 1 or 2 votes on the board that are going to not like it because it means they might lose their jobs.
All right, we'll follow up on that at another meeting if you don't mind. I hate to rush you, but if you got a final comment or anybody have a question. Okay, Auditor Harmon has a question.
Just to follow up on that proxy voting, I know there's some concerns. You were talking about buyout might actually make the stocks go up higher, but you also have to be careful because if they're buying for an ESG reason, it may make it temporarily go up, but certainly if they're going contradictory to, for instance, there was one situation where they took over an oil company and tried to divest from their primary source of income. So I would probably suggest if it looks like they're doing it for ESG, I would vote with management if I was you. That would just be a recommendation.
Yes. No, we are definitely, we want to vote bottom line for what is going to improve the value of that company. That is the only consideration that we have as actuaries. And I know we get asked about TRS, are we ESG investors? We are not.
Auditor Harmon, thank you for the question. Bo, thank you for the answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Your time. We hate to see you go. But thank you for all the information you brought to us today. We'll continue next month. We have 2 other presentations we got to squeeze in here before everyone's gone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Bo. And the American Bo, if you want to come up, I give you about. Can you give us a Cliff Note version on yours, and we'll get Mr. Eager a few minutes. Thank you. Identify yourself for the record and please proceed.
Okay, I'm going to share. Did I do that right? All right, so for the record, my name is Bo Craycraft, and I'm the Executive Director at Judicial Form Retirement System. I do have an abbreviated presentation. I only have 3 slides, so I will get started real quickly. We're just here to do investments, asset allocation, and cash flow. So slide 2 is just a quick snapshot of investment returns. Much like you just saw with Mr. Barnes and TRS plan, we did experience negative returns as well, largely driven by the U.S. equity markets. We'll see on our next slide that we have an allocation of 70-30, 70% equity, which is all large cap U.S. equity And then we complement that with a 30% target to short-term government credit fixed income. It's largely been on the corporate side, very, very minimal governmental bonds recently. Equity markets just struggled, down 10% for the year, down 16% just in the final quarter of the fiscal year. And so that drove those returns, especially in the short term. Looking out at the 3, 5, 10, and 20 year, we still see pretty strong positive results, both on an absolute term, but also relative to the benchmark. And, inception to date, which is a little over 25 years for the two larger pools of assets, we're just over 8.5%, which exceeds the actuarial assumed rate of return. Slide 2 is just snapshot of asset allocation. As I just mentioned, we currently have a target of 70% equity, 30% fixed income. You can see we have a small exposure to cash, and it's actually a little abnormal from prior quarters. We generally hold very minimal cash, but with the rising rate environment, we're seeing a lot of bonds kind of maturing or being called early, and so it's been a little bit harder for us. I think our Baird and Trust Company is just a little hesitant to put money into the bond market right now. So we're a little underweight on the bond side, as you can see, and that underweight is being taken with cash right now. That's not a long-term trend, but that's, kind of where we're at in the market. And, we've historically been a little bit above average of 70 on equity, but they did 3 rebalances in fiscal year 2022, kind of with the expectation that as rates rose, we were going to see kind of a correction in the equity market. So we're right at target, but that's with 3 rebalances during the fiscal year. And then lastly is just the standard cash flow template. Just real quickly, a couple of things I would point out is, first, our negative cash flow. We do experience negative cash flow. It's pretty normal for our plan for 2 reasons. One, we're not really asking for much from the employers. On the LRP side, you can see in that second row, we've received no funding. We barely asked for any this fiscal year, but we haven't received any employer contributions. And so that's one of the primary reasons. On the JRP side, we asked for a little over $7 million for these 2 fiscal years. That request went down again in this current budget to just over $4 million. So we're asking for a little bit more money, or a little less money, and so, but that's largely due to the funding of the plans. And so, as a plan, we're fully funded, or almost fully funded in both sides. So you're going to experience some negative cash flow. Just that's the nature of how these things operate.
Do we have any questions for Bo? Seeing none, thank you, sir, and appreciate that brief report. Mr. Eager, please give us the
Sure.
Cliff Notes version and okay.
I'm David Eager. I'm the chair of the KPPA, Kentucky Public Pensions Authority, and I'm the executive director. And I have on the screen also our CIO, Steve. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Steve Willer, CIO of KPPA.
Okay. Mr. Co-Chair, how much time would you like to allot for this?
You have about 15 minutes.
Okay, we can do it. I think we can do it pretty easily then.
Okay, thank you.
By the
and
way,
welcome your new CIO.
Yeah, I'm going to speak about him in just a second. But
Okay.
by the way, to your question, yes, we use Ice Miller. We use Indianapolis Ice Miller, and Rob Goss is our contact. So we are fortunate to have Steve Willer with us. He became the CIO on June 1st, and I say we're fortunate because we had him on the bench He was the deputy CIO. He's got 25 years' experience. Work in the investment industry, working for Invesco, working for Deutsche Investment Management, and also working for Commonwealth Bank of Australia. So that we're fortunate in that regard. We're fortunate we got House Bill 297 last year, which allows us now to pay more competitive wages for our 6 of our investment positions. We have 3 of them filled right now, so that's going to help recruitment and retention. And we're also fortunate we got a pretty substantial amount of additional funding both in state police and K-9 has. So from that standpoint, it was a good year. Let me give you some highlights, if you will. And when done with the highlights, if you're going to dig into a particular area, Mr. Chair, Vice Chair, we'll do that, or I'll go quickly through the rest
Just
of it.
go quickly for the record, and we'll
Okay.
follow up again next
Yeah.
month. I'm sorry we simply ran out of time today.
Sure. Well, here's a perspective on 2022. It was a tough year, as everybody alluded, and this shows how tough it was. So the U.S. equity market by the Wilshire was down 13.2. The all-world ex-U.S. index was down 19.4. The bond index was down 10.3. And the Wilshire Tux universe, which is a universe of over 100 public funds, the average fund was down 10.6%. So it was a tough year. There was no place to hide. Public equity may have been one area, real estate may have been another. For us, on a relative basis, it was a good year. We were down 5.73, and I hate to say a good year when you look at a minus 5.73, but in light of what happened, it was a good year for us. It's the worst year we've had since 2009 when we were down 17.2. And we've met or exceeded our benchmarks in 85% of the 1, 3, 5, and 10-year periods. So from that standpoint, I feel good about it. Net cash flow was positive in all pension funds except CER's non-hazardous, and that was negative by 12.7. So pensions, a positive cash flow, and that's money coming in from contributions, money coming in from dividends and interest, minus money going out for benefit payments and expenses. Pensions was 432, not including 215 million for the state police, and insurance, and 4 out of 5 were positive. Insurance, we were positive 158 million, net of 2 plans that were minus, negative about $10 million. So we're in a good positive cash position, not counting changes in market values, realized and unrealized. So, and the reason we're getting a tremendously high level of contributions. So K-9 has is a very mature plan. We have less than 0.7 of a person working for every one person that's retired. So the demand for paying benefits for retirees is tremendous in that plan. And how can you be cash flow positive in that situation? You can, because the contribution rates have to be so high to fund that. So we're appreciative of the changes that took place in 2019 and increasing contribution rates across the board significantly. But that's you would think we would be the negative cash flow person. People were not. We're the positive.
Dave, everybody, we always feared 1-to-1 ratio.
Yeah.
Never dreamed I'd hear a 0.7 to 1 ratio.
Yeah, actually 0.68 or 0.67. So, yeah, and I say frequently, I don't know where Social Security is now, but it was about 2.5, and they were quite concerned. And all around the world, that's a number that people are looking at, and we're in a dire situation there. But the combination of the additional contribution rate for K-9 has and the move to fixed allocation funding has really cured that problem. I mean, we're on the right track. Number 2, the $215 million state police appropriation reduced the contribution rate from 140% to 99%. That's both pension and insurance. It increased the funded status from 30.7 to 51.1. So they can recalculate the funded status for June 30th, 2021. This payment didn't go until May of 22, but it's in there, and they're not going to do a new val on June of 21, but if you look at the liability at that point and then add in that 215 million, we'd be 51.1% funded in the state police fund, and that'll probably go up a little bit this year in spite of the bad market. If you smooth out a 1%, roughly 1% return 2 years ago, a roughly 25% return. This is for all the plans. Last year, roughly minus 5%. I think if in all that 3-year period, all the plans will have met their assumptions, or they're darn close. K9 has, I think, will have exceeded it. But so bad year, good year, bad year, smoothed out, it will result in a return that's higher than the 5.25 for K9 has. We got a number of allocations that are outside of their ranges. If we get enough time, we're going to get a little more specific on that. Cash infusions that have not been fully invested. State Police is a good example. It came in May 15th of this year, and we've got $215 million. We've got a lot of it invested, but we still got a ways to go. Real estate and equity targets were increased by the board. So if we say, gee, the target is 5%, and you got 5, now we're making the target 10, we're out of. And some of these areas are hard to find investments. They're illiquid. It takes time in some of these cases to get invested. And we're making progress. If you looked at, I looked at August the 5th versus June the 30th. In all but 2 cases, we're making progress on reducing those variances. And the 2 cases were not. They're essentially right on track with where they were. Rates of return. There's the -5.2 for K9 has. I'll pick the key ones. -5.9 for C9 has. The reason is C9 has is a little more aggressively invested, has a little more equities, and it was a lousy year for equities. Our 20-year numbers, these are all net of fees. 20 years, 6.5, and 30 years, 7.7 for K9 has, 6.6 and 7.8 for K has, or for CERS 9 has, 6.6 and 7.8. So there, in a ways, when you look at the longer numbers, as I was sitting looking at the 2 prior presentations and their 20 and 30-year numbers, were almost the same, almost exactly the same. In some cases, we're a little better. It's not a horse race, but nonetheless. Insurance, very similar. Cash flow, I'll walk down, if you don't mind, I'll walk down the very first column, fiscal year 22, KERS 9 has. We had member contributions of $89 million, and that dropped a little bit. We had employer contributions. We're now using the normal cost. The 141.1 is the normal cost compared to what was the 83% of payroll number a year earlier, which was $958 million. So we're looking at normal costs, and then the $912 million is the allocation of the unfunded liability to all the. So the first thing I did when I looked at this, I go, something's wrong here. Why does that add up to $1,053.8, and we had 958 last year? The 958 did not include what should have been there for the quasi waiver. So had the quasi-waiver been paid in 2021, those numbers would be much more comparable. I would say also that a payroll declined by $50 million year to year. If we had been on the old percent of pay contribution rate, the contribution rate for the pension was about 67%. We would have $32 million less had we stayed on the old formula because the payroll continued to decline. So thank you all for passing that bill. It's been a savior. And thank you to Representative Tipton and Representative Wheatley and Representative Miller, who was here but is gone, because you were 3 key players in that. So walking on down, we've had some secession payments this year from Kentucky Housing. We have net investment income. That's dividends and interest. It's cash flowing in. So we have inflows of $1,259,000,000. We have benefit payments of $1,035,000,000 and administrative expenses of $13,500,000. So an outflow of $1,049,000. So we're cash flow positive in that plan. Just cash flow, $210 million. And then we had the bad market effect, $218 million decline in market value of assets. So a slight negative. Questions?
I don't see any. You have about 5 minutes if you want to wrap it up.
Yep, let's go. C plan is slightly negative. You know, we don't have the higher contribution rates that we do in the K plan. The phase-in is completed in 2022, so we got some benefit of the last uptick in the phase-in. Insurance, not as, I don't want to say it's not exciting, but it's, you know, a similar pattern, if I can. Here's the question you raised about allocations. I would say, so we're showing, the way, we're each doing a little different format, same information, but slightly different comes down on the page. But we're showing here, in this case, we're starting with CERS non-HAS on the left and working our way all the way over to state police. And I'll walk down CERS non-HAS if you would. We first show the actual as of June 30th, 45.99 for public equities. The target's 50 and the range is 35 to 65. And so the numbers in red are the ones that where we are outside of the range. Now we're going to be above and below targets all the time based on maybe a variety of things, including cash flow, but it may simply be we want to be underweighted or want to be overweighted. And I think the real issue for PPOB is when you're outside of the range, the approved range, that's a red flag. So they're so noted here. And I'm going to let Steve speak to some of these. Specialty credit, we're at 2103. The range is 7 to 13 for C. Real return, we're at 397. The range is 9 to 17. Moving over to K, non-HAS. We're cash, we got 13%. The range is 0 to 10. And Steve's going to speak to why that is and what we're doing about it. Real return at 3 versus 7 to 13, and down at the bottom, real estate 564 versus 7 to 13. And then K hazardous has more. Specialty credit, core fixed incomes, slightly over the top of the target. Cash, real return, and real estate. And of course, state police is the one that's got the big number. We are at 24% in state police versus a range of 0 to 10. We took in $215 million, and that changed the allocation substantially. So it all comes into cash. Cash allocation goes from a relatively small amount to a great big amount, and we're working it back down. And we'll speak to that. Am I going too fast? Okay. That's insurance. Insurance is essentially the same as pensions. So there's a slide in there for insurance if you'd like to look at variances, but they're almost identical to the pension. Almost. They're pretty well represented. So here's some of our comments about pension variances, and I'm going to let Steve toss the podium to you, Steve.
All right, thank you. Appreciating everyone's time. I'll try to be as brief as possible and just to hit the highlights on these slides. As Dave mentioned, there's a number of asset classes across plans where we are outside of the allowable ranges, and those have been for a variety of reasons. Cash flow experience, we've had changes in IPS allocation targets and ranges, especially given the separation of KERS and the CERS and adoption of new allocation targets and ranges, which resulted in reduction in some asset classes, increases in other asset classes. Some of the asset classes, especially those in more private markets, take longer time to shift those allocations. And that's especially evident in the specialty credit. In the specialty credit, you can see for the CERS, the new IPS allocation targets were decreased by 5%. At the same time, you may remember there was an opportunistic allocation. That allocation went away in the assets that the majority or the bulk of the assets that were in that opportunistic allocation were shifted into specialty credit. And that was about 300 to 350 basis points. So 3.5% shifted from opportunistic to specialty credit, which increased our allocation there. I think probably the most important thing, again, in light of time, is I think I probably have a little bit of a philosophical difference than maybe how things had been managed in the past. And that really is we work, the investment staff works with the investment committees and the boards to establish those allocation targets and the ranges. And really that range is the discretion that the investment committees and the board has granted the investment staff. And that's really the area where we should be able to operate in the investment discretion. So while we have a number of searches underway, we have some committed capital, especially in real estate, about 3 to 4%. Or 300 to 400 million in committed capital that has not been called. So that will get called over time, and you'll naturally see that allocation increase. We have active searches in the real return space. We're looking at opportunities with existing managers and new managers in the private equity space. But I would anticipate going forward, you will see us within the range, not, as Dave mentioned, not necessarily at target. We'll be shorter, or we'll be implementing tactical views within that allocation range. But our desire going forward is to really operate within discretion within those ranges. So I would anticipate over the coming quarters, you'll see all of our asset classes move to within that range.
Yeah.
Okay. Steve, thank you. Congratulations again on your
Thank you very much.
your new position, and look forward to working with you.
Thank you.
Mr. Eager,
I had one last thing quickly, but it's not.
I made a commitment to get several people out here about 5 o'clock that have stayed to the very end. So
This may take 60 seconds. If
okay, you got it.
Tier 3, I'm sorry, Senator, that Senator Thayer's not here. Let me explain this. Tier 3 has a 5-year averaging. That's when people get paid. And I'll tell you, the Tier 3 people watch every year. What's the rate going to be they're going to get? And we're worried this year. But it's got a 5-year smoothing. Up top, the top two rows, 17 through 22, are the 5-year ending that 17, 5-year ending 18, and so forth. And you see 7, 7, 7, 5, 5, fairly stable because you're doing a 5-year smoothing, which is perfect for that Tier 3. The bottom row is the 4% plus 75% of the gain over 4%. That's the formula. You're going to get 4%. You're going to get. So if you look at 624, the upper right, CERS 5-year was 624 this year, so they're 2.24 over the 4%. They get 75% of that. That's 1.68%. That's how you get to the 568. The point of showing this is it's working. I mean, it does a really good job of maintaining stability for these people.
Thank you very much, and my apologies for cutting you short. We'll put you on first the next time and give you plenty of time.
I think.
Motion to adjourn.
Yeah.
We are adjourned. Thank